A colossal alien ship orbits a silent Earth, its faith built upon a stolen human past. By the end of this story, you will discover the shocking truth behind history's greatest theft and what it means for our future. On the bridge of the dreadnought Chronicle of Ages, Archivist Primate Xylos prays over a hologram of the Great Pyramid, calling humans his divine ancestors. His worship is shattered by a single report, a human distress signal flaring from the dead ruins of New York City. This beacon is not a call for help, but a trap that will crack a galactic religion wide open. What would you do if you discovered your entire civilization was built on a lie? The beacon was a lie, a ghost signal from a dead world. Captain Elias Vance watched the alien skiff descend through the perpetual twilight of New York, its sleek silver form a stark contrast against the skeletal remains of skyscrapers. His team, a handful of humans surviving in the planet's corpse, waited in the shadow of a collapsed bank vault. They were not warriors but scavengers, their weapons a patchwork of salvaged parts and desperation. The plan was simple, born of a wild gamble. Activate a pre-collapse military distress pulse, then wait for the curious faithful to come and worship. The Aethel always came. The skiff settled on a plaza of cracked concrete, where weeds grew through the fossilized husks of old vehicles. Its ramp lowered without a sound. What emerged were not soldiers, but figures draped in flowing robes of cobalt and silver, their movements reverent and slow. They ignored the strategic high ground, the potential ambush points. Their attention was fixed on a single, rusted artifact near the landing site, a twisted metal sculpture that once read, "I Heart NY." To Vance, peering through his scope, it was a relic of a tacky, forgotten tourism campaign. To the Aethel, it was clearly a holy icon. He watched, his breath still, as the alien visitors approached the ruined sign. They did not scan for threats, they did not raise weapons. Instead, they bowed, then prostrated themselves on the grimy asphalt, chanting in their soft, melodic language. It was a gesture of pure, unguarded devotion. In that moment, the sheer, terrifying scale of their delusion became real for Vance. These advanced beings, capable of interstellar flight, were kneeling before scrap metal because it came from us. The ambush was almost pitifully easy. His team moved from the ruins like ghosts, using grapples and stun charges designed to overload alien neural systems without causing permanent harm. The robed figures fell silently, their prayers cut short. Only one remained conscious long enough to see a human face emerge from the shadows. It was the priest Zoran. His large, dark eyes widened, not in fear of capture, but in world-shattering recognition. He looked past Vance's grime-streaked features, past the makeshift rifle, and saw the myth made flesh. As the neural dampener took effect, his translator unit emitted one final, broken phrase, a transmission sent in a burst back to his orbiting ship. The words were thick with awe and horror. "The progenitors, they live." Then the signal died, and the only sound was the wind whistling through the canyons of a dead city, now holding a prisoner that could change everything. The bunker beneath the ruins smelled of damp concrete and ozone from the jury-rigged power grid. Captain Vance sat across a makeshift table from the alien priest, Zoran, whose robes were now stained with dust from the city above. The interrogation was not going as planned. Vance expected fear, defiance, perhaps a tactical silence. He did not expect reverence. Zoran's voice, filtered through a cracked translation unit, was soft with awe. He did not speak of invasion fleets or territorial claims. He spoke of a pilgrimage. He called the event that nearly wiped humanity out the Great Sorrow, a cosmic tragedy his ancestors witnessed from afar. By the time their slower-than-light generational ships finally reached our solar system, he explained, Earth was already a tomb, its great networks silent, its cities empty. They came as archaeologists, not conquerors. They found our databases decaying, our monuments crumbling, our history scattered like leaves in a storm. They gathered it all, every fragment they could salvage, the complete works of Shakespeare recovered from a university server farm, the schematics for a coffee maker found etched on a durable tablet. The last broadcast of a child's cartoon, the final entry in a digital diary, the rusted frame of a bicycle. To them, it was all sacred. They could not separate our art from our advertisements, our profound philosophies from our casual grocery list. They took it as a whole, the entire messy, glorious output of a species they believed had ascended to a higher plane of existence, leaving their physical forms behind. "We are the keepers of the legacy," Zoran said, his large eyes glistening in the low light. "We guard the holy works of the progenitors, our entire society, our laws, our art, our purpose. It is built upon the stewardship of your truth." In the corner of the bunker, Kayla, the team's tech specialist, let out a short, bitter laugh. She was elbow-deep in the wiring of a salvaged water reclaimer, her hands black with grime. "She didn't even look up. They worship our trash," she muttered, her voice cutting through the priest's solemn testimony. "They build temples around our junk mail and sing hymns to our broken toys. Meanwhile, we're down here literally fighting over the last functioning water filter from that same golden age. The irony is so thick you could choke on it." Vance watched Zoran flinch at the word trash. To the priest, it was blasphemy. This was the core of the staggering delusion. The Aethel had enshrined our history, but they had completely misunderstood its context. They saw a divine, curated legacy. We knew it was the chaotic, unedited, often ridiculous record of a species just trying to figure things out. They venerated us as perfect ancestors. We knew we were never anything of the sort, and now the living, breathing, struggling proof of that imperfection was sitting in a damp room, staring at their would-be saint, wondering how to break the news to a galaxy of true believers that their gods were not only mortal but messy and still very much alive. The silence in the bunker was broken only by the methodical search of Zoran's belongings. His satchel, woven from some iridescent alien fiber, contained what he called devotional aids. There were polished fragments of circuit boards mounted on velvet, a small, perfectly preserved plastic toy soldier missing its head, and a data crystal containing what his translator called the Litany of Nutritional Guidance, which turned out to be a salvaged digital cookbook for microwave lasagna. But it was the final item that made the human crew stop and stare. With immense trembling care, Zoran himself gestured for them to examine it. It was a flat, rigid case. Inside, protected by a clear laminate, was a single issue of an old comic book. The cover was faded but unmistakable, showing a man in a blue and red suit lifting a car over his head. The title read, Superman. Zoran's voice was a hushed, reverent whisper. "This," he said, "is one of our most sacred texts, the saga of the Kryptonian savior. It details the journey of a meta-being from a doomed world who adopted your form to guide and protect you. We believe it is a historical chronicle, a testament to the progenitor's interaction with higher dimensional guardians." He pointed a slender finger at the panels. "See here, the ritualized conflict with the being called Luther, a parable of the struggle between enlightened progress and selfish ambition. And this, the secret identity of Clark Kent, a profound teaching on humility and walking among the common folk while holding divine power." Kayla, who had been listening while tinkering with a scanner, finally looked over. She blinked, then a snort escaped her, then a full, incredulous laugh that echoed off the concrete walls. "Oh, you have got to be kidding me," she wheezed, wiping a tear from her eye. "That's not history, that's a comic book, fiction, something kids used to buy for a few cents for fun. Superman isn't real, he was never real. Krypton is a made-up planet." It's a story. The change in Zoran was not instantaneous. It was a slow, terrible collapse. His large eyes, fixed on Kayla, seemed to lose their inner light like stars being swallowed by a black hole. The certainty that had held his posture erect began to leak away. His gaze dropped to the laminated page, to the brightly colored panels he had spent a lifetime studying for divine truth. All is parable. The question was a soft, broken thing. It wasn't just about the comic book, it was about everything. The microwave lasagna liturgy, the holy toy soldier. The sacred rusted sign. If this cornerstone of his belief was just a child's fantasy, then what was the foundation? His entire reality, the cosmology that gave his life order and meaning, crumbled in that single, agonized moment. His faith didn't just shatter, it vaporized, leaving behind a hollow, horrified understanding. The raw, silent despair in the bunker was so thick it was stifling. Vance opened his mouth, though he had no idea what to say. How do you apologize for destroying a universe? But before any sound could come out, the scanner on the table between them erupted in a frantic, synchronized chorus of beeps. Kayla lunged for it, her earlier mirth gone, her face pale. The screen was a blaze of crimson icons swarming in from the upper atmosphere and converging on their exact coordinates. "Tracker signals," she said, her voice tight, dozens of them. The priest's last transmission, they followed the burst. The Aethel aren't just coming to worship. They're coming for their holy man. And the echo of Zoran's shattered whisper, "All is parable," still hung in the air as the first distant hum of alien dropships began to vibrate through the bones of the dead city above. The hum of the dropships became a deafening roar directly overhead. Dust rained from the bunker ceiling as Vance shouted the only order that mattered: move. They grabbed their gear and a now catatonic Zoran, fleeing deeper into the sub-basement maze, the priest moving like a puppet with its strings cut. Behind them, the screech of metal being torn open signaled the enforcers had found their nest. The tunnels were a claustrophobic nightmare of dripping pipes and collapsed passages, but Kayla led the way, her scanner mapping a path from old maintenance schematics. The only exit she could find that wasn't already swarming led up into the heart of what the Aethel had transformed. They burst through a rusted service door and the world exploded into light and sound. They stood at the edge of a vast, cavernous space, but it was utterly unrecognizable from the grand central terminal of old. The familiar concourse was gone, replaced by a forest of slender, glowing pillars that reached up to the restored celestial mural on the vaulted ceiling, which now shimmered with artificial constellations tracing what looked like a distorted map of human migration. The air thrummed with a low, harmonic chant from hundreds of Aethel pilgrims, all robed in varying shades of blue and silver, their faces upturned in devotion. This was no ruined relic, it was a living, breathing cathedral of steel and light, a monument to a history that never was. In the center, on a raised dais where the information booth once stood Archivist Primate Xylos. His voice, amplified and serene, washed over the crowd. He spoke of the progenitors of their glorious, intentional departure from the physical realm, their essence merging with the cosmic data stream. He gestured to a holographic projection that cycled through images, a jumbled tapestry of human achievement, a statue of David beside a vintage soda advertisement, a clip of the moon landing intercut with a cartoon cat chasing a mouse. "See the wisdom," he intoned, "the mundane and the magnificent woven together in a grand tapestry of meaning." Their ascension was a lesson in humility, leaving behind these breadcrumbs of their journey for us, their faithful children, to follow. Vance and Kayla, having hastily draped themselves in robes stripped from two stunned acolytes in the tunnel, tried to melt into the crowd. The disguise was paper-thin, their human stature and gait all wrong, but the pilgrims were entranced, their eyes fixed on Xylos. For a moment, it seemed they might make it to a side archway. Then Kayla's stolen robe caught on a protruding piece of ceremonial scaffolding. She stumbled and the hood fell back. A pilgrim beside her turned, not in alarm but in curious awe, reaching out to touch her human hair. The movement caught the eye of an enforcer stationed at the base of the dais, its sleek helmet scanning the crowd. Its sensor array flashed from neutral blue to hostile crimson. It did not shout a warning. It simply raised its weapon, a graceful, silent device that glowed with a soft, deadly light. The first shot was not a blast, but a pulse of concussive force meant to incapacitate. It shattered a glowing pillar beside Vance, showering the nearby pilgrims in crystalline shards. The serene chant fractured into screams of confusion and terror. Xylos' sermon cut off, his magnified voice replaced by the shriek of enforcer alarms. What followed was chaos, but a surreal, asymmetrical chaos. Vance and his crew fired back with their crude, kinetic rifles, the loud bangs shocking in the resonant space. The enforcers moved with fluid, silent precision, their energy pulses searing the air. But the pilgrims, the faithful, did not flee in panic. Many fell to their knees, not in fear of the firefight, but in awe of the progenitors manifesting violence in their sacred space. They saw the battle as a divine mystery, a new, terrifying chapter of their scripture playing out before them. Vance saw a woman clutching her children, not to shield them, but to point at Kayla as she returned fire, whispering what must have been a prayer. They were not combatants, they were an audience, and their reverent paralysis made the frantic escape even more horrifying. Pushing through a sea of worshippers who reached for them as if for blessings, Vance made it to the archway, dragging Zorin behind him. He took one last look back at the Cathedral of Steel, now lit by the flashes of energy weapons and the bewildered faces of a galaxy that worshipped a ghost that was now shooting at them. The escape from the cathedral was a blur of adrenaline and alien corridors, but Kayla's hand had closed around a small, crystalline data sliver knocked from an enforcer's belt during the scramble. Back in the relative safety of a new hideout, a buried subway maintenance room, she jacked it into her scavenged decoder, expecting troop movements or security codes. What poured across the screen instead was a revelation that left them all speechless. It was not a military database, it was a devotional archive, a sprawling digital cathedral of human history as seen through the Aethel's reverent, utterly distorted lens. The files were categorized not by date or fact, but by perceived spiritual significance. Kayla scrolled through endless entries. There was the ritual of Gettysburg, not a historical battle analysis, but a choreographed annual pageant performed on a terraformed plain light years away, where Aethel, in approximation of blue and gray uniforms, recited what they believed were the profound philosophical speeches of the leaders, speeches that were actually a garbled mix of political addresses, lines from a period romance novel, and a farmer's almanac entry about crop rotation. Then she found the ceremony of lunar footfall. The video showed a vast, domed arena on another world. Aethel, in bulky, ceremonial suits meant to mimic astronauts, moved in slow, precise steps across a gray sand floor, planting not a flag, but a holographic emblem that combined the old NAS, a logo, with the golden arches of a fast food chain, two symbols they had found equal prominence in the data stream and assumed were linked. The narrator's voice, soft and full of awe, described this as humanity's final, symbolic step before ascension, a touching farewell to physical exploration. But the most chilling file was an educational vid for Aethel Young. It used simple animations and a gentle, instructive tone. It showed stylized human figures glowing with light, their bodies dissolving not into nothing, but into streams of data, books, films, music, even receipts and traffic reports. The teacher's voice explained the progenitors did not die. They chose to become their own history. They transcended fragile flesh to exist eternally as story, as art, as legacy. Their great gift was to leave this legacy for us, so we might learn from its perfection and one day, if we are worthy, join them in the cosmic record. Captain Vance watched, a cold knot tightening in his stomach. This was the core of the galactic faith. Humanity hadn't been wiped out in a tragedy. In their eyes, we had voluntarily evolved into deities of information, and the silent, artifact-strewn earth was our sacred tomb, a shrine to be protected. Our every mundane act was scripture. Our every mistake was a purposeful parable. This belief wasn't a side note in their culture, it was their culture. It dictated their laws, their art, their science, their purpose. They weren't just studying us, they were living a religion built on a museum of our lives, a museum where the placards were all wrong. Kayla leaned back from the flickering screen, her face illuminated by the glow of a billion misunderstandings. So their whole civilization, she said quietly, is a planet-wide historical reenactment society performing a play where they don't know the plot, the lines, or that the original actors are still hiding backstage. And we just walked onto their stage and started rewriting the script. The question now wasn't just how to survive. It was what happens to a galaxy when you prove its gods are not only mortal, but were never divine to begin with. The truth they had captured was more dangerous than any weapon. The debate on the bridge of the Chronicle of Ages was a quiet, seething thing, a conflict of faith fought with whispered arguments and glacial stares. Archivist Primate Xylos stood before the main viewer, the image of the silent earth hanging behind him like a sacred icon. Facing him was Prelate Vorlak, commander of the ship's martial orders, a being whose robes were edged not in silver, but in the dull gray of polished armor. The distress signal from the surface, Zoran's final broken transmission, these were not mysteries to Vorlak, they were a contagion. They are ghosts, Vorlak stated, his voice a low, grinding vibration. Echoes in the machine, nothing more. Perhaps a fragment of old automation, a malfunctioning beacon imitating the progenitor form. Or worse, a psychic phantom, a collective trauma in the data stream we have mistaken for truth. His hand rested on the hilt of his energy blade, a gesture not of threat but of finality. Their existence is a heresy against the great sorrow. If the living faithful were to learn that physical progenitors still scuttle in the dust, it would unravel the legacy itself. The purity of the faith demands these phantoms be cleansed, purged, before their illusion can spread. Xylos did not shout. He felt the weight of Zoran's shattered report, the haunting question, all is parable, echoing in his own mind. He saw the frantic, violent escape in the Cathedral of Steel, not as a divine mystery, but as something terrifyingly mortal. What if they are not phantoms? He asked, his voice straining to maintain its customary serenity. What if Zoran beheld the truth, not ascended spirits, but living relics, the ultimate artifacts? Would purging them not be the greatest sacrilege imaginable? To destroy the last original sources? You speak of sources, Vorlak countered, stepping closer. Our sources are pure. They are the curated legacy, the history the progenitors chose to leave for us, filtered through the lens of their ascension. These things on the surface, they are the dross left behind. The imperfect shell they shed, studying them would corrupt the doctrine. It would introduce error, confusion, fleshly weakness back into our perfect understanding. We protect the faith, archivist, by protecting its perfect, finished story. This was the schism laid bare. Vorlak's faith was rigid, a fortress that could not tolerate a single crack. Xylos's faith now was a trembling thing, more terrified of being wrong than of facing a new, uncomfortable truth. One saw living humans as a disease to be eradicated. The other saw them as the most holy of archaeological finds, to be preserved under glass, even if their very presence shattered the display case. The command council fractured along invisible lines. The archivists and theologians, their curiosity battling their terror, leaned toward Xylos. The martial orders, the enforcers, the doctrinal purists stood with Vorlak. The Chronicle of Ages, a vessel built for peaceful pilgrimage, hummed with the tension of a coming storm. Vorlak did not wait for a consensus. Faith, to him, required decisive action. In the silent watch cycle, he summoned his most loyal enforcers to a sealed armory deep in the ship's tactical spine. He gave no grand speech. His orders were simple, absolute, and utterly final. The progenitor ghosts in the eastern seaboard ruin zone are a doctrinal infection. He told the faceless helmets before him, "You will descend, you will locate. You will sterilize the site with plasma. Leave no biological trace, no artifact of their continued existence. Purge it all. Then you will report a tectonic gas vent eruption as the cause. The faith must remain pure. The legacy must remain unsullied by the messy, contradictory truth of living history. As the kill squad moved to their drop ship, a sleek and predatory vessel compared to the pilgrim skiffs, Xylos stood alone in the main archive. He watched the data stream of human history play across a dozen screens, the jumbled, beautiful, chaotic record he had loved his entire life. For the first time, he wondered if he was watching a eulogy written by the deceased or a diary they had never finished. And down on the dark, ruined Earth, unaware that the heavens had just decreed their extinction, Vance's crew prepared for another scavenging run, their only warning the gathering silence of the empty streets above. The hydro plant was a tomb of dripping shadows and the low groan of dead turbines. Vance's team was cornered, their backs against a massive, rusted filtration tank. Outside, the kill squad advanced with methodical, silent menace, their energy blades casting a cold blue glow on the wet concrete. There was no exit, no clever ambush left. Their crude bullets sparked harmlessly off the enforcers' personal shields. This was not a fight, it was an execution, a quiet sterilization of inconvenient truths. In that moment, with death gliding toward them in the dark, Captain Vance's mind did not turn to prayer or last stands. It turned to the one thing these aliens valued more than their own lives, the story. He fumbled with his comm unit, overriding every protocol to punch a signal straight up, not on a military band, but on the open devotional frequency the Aethel used for planetary broadcasts. He was gambling that curiosity was a stronger force than dogma. Archivist Primate Xylos received the crackling transmission in his private sanctum, the desperate human voice cutting through the serene liturgical chants. "You want real history," the voice gasped, punctuated by the whine of a near-miss energy blast. "We have it, not your curated parables, the messy, ugly, brilliant truth. Save us from your fanatic, and we'll tell you the truth about everything." The line filled with static and the sound of scrambling, about why we really fought our wars. About what the moon landing actually meant, about Superman, the name of the Kryptonian savior, spoken not with reverence but with raw human urgency, was the final devastating hook. Xylos stared at the comm panel, his world splitting into two impossible paths. Vorlak offered purity, a faith preserved in amber, flawless and dead. This human ghost offered a key to the archive, a chance to see the source code of the legacy itself. It was the ultimate temptation for a scholar, or the ultimate blasphemy. His faith, already fractured, now faced a choice. Would it be a shield that killed truth, or a vessel that could somehow hold it? The silence that followed Vance's plea stretched for an eternity. Then, without a word to the command council, Xylos input a series of codes known only to the highest archivists. In the hydro plant, the air before Vance's team began to shimmer and hum with a different, warmer frequency than the enforcer's cold blue light. Figures materialized from the glow, not in the sleek armor of Vorlak's purifiers, but in the simpler robes of the monastic guard, their weapons held with the reluctant resolve of librarians forced to defend their stacks. They formed a shimmering energy barrier between the humans and the advancing kill squad. For a moment, the two groups of Aethel simply faced each other, a silent schism given physical form. Then, without a shout or a curse, the battle began. It was a fierce, eerily quiet conflict of searing light and humming shields, fought amidst the skeletal remains of human industry. Crimson and azure energy pulses cut through the gloom, ricocheting off iron catwalks and evaporating pools of stagnant water. The monastic guards fought defensively, their goal not to destroy Vorlak's fanatics, but to contain them, to protect the living artifacts cowering behind them. It was history itself under siege in that decaying place, a war over narrative waged with plasma. Vance watched breathless as two versions of his own legacy tried to erase each other. One saw him as a holy relic to be preserved, the other saw him as a stain to be scrubbed clean. and he, the original document, could only wait to see which interpretation would win the right to define him. The outcome would decide whether humanity's future was as a museum exhibit or as ash on the floor of a forgotten power plant. The journey from the dripping hydro plant to the sterile light of the alien vessel was a blur of disorientation. One moment, Vance was tasting ozone and rust. The next, he was breathing recycled, perfumed air aboard the scroll of Endeavor. Their sanctuary was a gilded cage, a suite of rooms that felt less like quarters and more like a meticulously curated exhibit. The walls were smooth, pearl-white panels that softly glowed, displaying rotating holograms of human artifacts, a toaster, a bicycle, a snow globe, each labeled in flowing alien script. The furniture was elegant but strange, all sweeping curves and no sharp corners, as if designed for beings who feared the very idea of edges. It was the pinnacle of reverence, and it felt utterly suffocating. They were not prisoners, they were priceless, fragile relics on display. Archivist Primate Xylos came to them alone, his grand ceremonial robes exchanged for a simpler gray tunic. He carried no guard, no weapon. His presence was not that of a warden, but of a pilgrim who had traveled across the stars to finally kneel at the original shrine. He stood before Captain Vance, his large, dark eyes filled with a terrifying mix of hope and dread. He did not demand, he asked, his voice barely a whisper, as if speaking too loudly might shatter the moment. "Tell me of your Washington," he began, choosing what he believed was a simple, foundational tale from the sacred texts. Was he truly a general of cherry trees and wooden teeth? "We have a great festival for this. The children reenact the ritual of the arboreal honesty." Vance stared at him, exhausted, grimy, and still vibrating with the adrenaline of near annihilation. He saw no malice in the alien's face, only a profound, scholarly hunger. The question hung in the air, so innocent, so perfectly, utterly wrong. The weight of an entire civilization's misunderstanding pressed down on him in that opulent room. There was no gentle way to do this. He took a breath. He didn't have the energy for poetry. He had only the blunt, unadorned facts. "No," he said, his voice flat and tired. "The cherry tree story is a fable for kids, a myth to teach about honesty. George Washington was a man, a soldier. He led a ragged army against a global empire because they wanted to govern themselves. He won a brutal, bloody war, and his dentures, they were made from ivory and metal and teeth taken from other people. Not wood, never wood. The effect on Xylos was immediate and visceral. He did not flinch or argue. He seemed to fold inward, as if Vance had not spoken words but had delivered a physical blow to his center. A tremor passed through his slender frame. His hands, which had been clasped in a gesture of attentive study, slowly uncurled. "The poetry of the truth," he murmured, his voice cracking, "is harsher." It was more than just correcting a historical detail. It was the demolition of a symbol. In Xylos' faith, the general of the cherry trees was a parable of peaceful virtue and natural wisdom. The reality was a complex, ambitious, flawed man who fought a vicious war and wore the teeth of the dead in his mouth. One was a clean, moral lesson. The other was messy, contradictory, and human. Xylos was not just learning a new fact, he was experiencing the death of a beautiful story and the painful, awkward birth of something real in its place. The sanctity of his entire museum was evaporating around him, leaving behind the raw, unvarnished material of history, and it smelled of blood and ivory, not cherry blossoms. The corridors of the Scroll of Endeavor were a living museum, and every turn revealed a new gallery of devotion. Xylos, now a guide haunted by his own questions, led the human crew through a vaulted hall that hummed with a low, reverent chant. "This," he said, his voice still carrying the echo of shattered parables, "is the chapel of woven indigo. We call it the Temple of Denim." The air inside was cool and smelled faintly of ozone and incense. In the center of the space, under a beam of crystalline light, rested a single artifact on a pedestal of polished black stone. It was a pair of levis faded to a pale blue, a small hole worn in one knee. Pilgrims in simple robes knelt at a respectful distance, their heads bowed. An archivist in deeper blue vestments spoke softly to a group of young Aethel, his words translated by the ambient systems. Observe the sturdy rivets, symbols of enduring strength, the double-stitched seams representing the duality of the physical and spiritual realms. The faded hue is not decay, but the gentle patina of timeless wisdom. This garment was worn by a progenitor in an act of humble labor, a testament to the sacredness of foundational work. Kayla stood frozen, her own worn, practical trousers suddenly feeling like a cosmic joke. She glanced at Vance, whose face was a mask of strained neutrality. They were witnessing a religion built around a pair of old pants. Further along, they passed a quieter, more intense sect gathered in a meditation alcove. Each member held a small, mundane object, a button, a buckle, a single metal tooth on a fabric tape. They were practitioners of the ritual zipper, Xylos explained, his tone shifting to one of scholarly distance. They believe the interlocking mechanism is a metaphysical key. Its sequential alignment and disalignment mirrors the soul's journey through states of being. Mastering its smooth operation in meditation is said to bring harmony to one's personal data stream. One acolyte, deep in concentration, slowly drew a zipper up and down on a cloth pouch, her eyes closed in profound focus. The sheer, staggering sincerity of it was what broke Kayla. It wasn't mockery she felt, but a desperate, clawing need to fix the disconnect. Later, in a quiet observation lounge, she found herself sitting with a few of the younger Aethel scholars who had been shadowing them, their tablets filled with frantic, anxious notes. They were terrified of their own questions. One, named Lirin, finally voiced the confusion gripping them all. "We have studied the liturgy of the 5 pockets for years," he said, his voice trembling. "The front pockets for immediate needs, the back for lasting treasures, the small one for secrets of the heart. It is a beautiful system. Are you saying it meant nothing?" Kayla chose her words like she was handling broken glass. She took a deep breath. "It meant something," she said gently, "but not that. Denim jeans, they were tough. They were for working, for building, for getting dirty. People wore them because they lasted. The rivets were to keep the seams from tearing under strain. The zipper was just convenient, better than buttons. The 5 pockets, one was for your wallet, one for your keys. The little one was originally for a pocket watch, then just for coins. It was design, simple, clever, practical design, not theology. The silence that followed was absolute. Lirin stared at his tablet, his large eyes wide. The beautiful, intricate cosmology of meaning he had built around woven cotton and brass evaporated into the sterile air. "If the sacred is profane," he whispered, not to Kayla, but to the universe itself, "what foundation do we have?" His question hung in the room, a tremor running through the very architecture of their understanding. Kayla had offered them the truth, but it felt like she had handed them a void. She had replaced their constellation of sacred stories with the stark, unyielding brick of utility, and they were left shivering in the new, meaningless dark. An alliance required common ground, but how do you build a bridge when one side discovers their holy land is just common dirt? The silence aboard the scroll of Endeavor shattered with a galaxy-wide broadcast. It was not the serene voice of the Archivist Primate, but the grinding, resonant tone of Prelate Vorlak, his image flickering on every screen. He stood on the command deck of the battleship Purity of Faith, a vessel now severed from the main fleet. His gray-edged robes were gone, replaced by stark, unadorned black armor. His eyes held no scholarly doubt, only the cold fire of absolute conviction. "By the authority of true doctrine," he declared, "the being known as Xylos is a heretic. He has been seduced by corporeal demons masquerading as our sacred progenitors. These creatures are not relics. They are a test, a final, vile temptation placed upon the sacred ground of earth to weed the weak from the faithful." His gaze seemed to pierce through the screen, aimed at every Aethel in the galaxy. To shelter them is apostasy, to listen to them is spiritual corruption. The only path to purity is cleansing fire. I call upon all true believers to join the crusade of sanctification. We will purge the holy soil of this living blasphemy and restore the legacy to its unsullied state. The transmission ended, leaving a void of static that felt louder than any alarm. Vorlak had not just declared rebellion, he had rewritten the entire narrative. He had taken the terrifying, confusing reality of living humans and framed it within the existing faith, not as a discovery but as a demonic trial. It was a masterstroke of doctrinal manipulation. He gave the terrified Orthodox a clear enemy and a holy purpose, transforming a crisis of belief into a rallying cry for war. Across 1,000 worlds, the militant wings of the faith answered. Ships began to break from their orbits, swearing allegiance to the purity of faith. The Aethel civilization, a culture of peaceful archivists and pilgrims, found itself tearing down the middle, its soul ripped between the terrifying uncertainty of truth and the comforting clarity of holy violence. For Xylos and the humans on the scroll, the calculus of survival changed instantly. They were no longer just misunderstood artifacts, they were the declared focal point of a galactic jihad. Their sanctuary had become the most hunted place in the cosmos. Xylos watched the reports flood in, his face ashen. He had feared a schism, but this was an exodus. Vorlak is not just a traitor to the Council, he whispered, his voice hollow. He is a surgeon cutting the doubt from the body of the faith by declaring it a cancer. He offers them a simpler truth, one that requires burning questions rather than answering them. Captain Vance understood the military reality immediately. He can rally a fleet faster than we can explain quantum physics, he said, standing before a star chart. Earth is a fixed target, a tomb they think needs defending from ghosts. He doesn't have to convince them we're evil, just that we're a stain, and stains are removed. The only chance they had, a vanishingly slim one, was to find a counter-narrative more powerful than Vorlak's call to crusade. They needed a truth so foundational, so undeniable, that it could crack the doctrinal armor of the militants before their weapons fired. It could not be another corrected fact about dentures or denim. It had to be the keystone, the one piece of human history so raw, so universally resonant that even a zealot might hesitate. Xylos, his scholar's mind now racing against a doomsday clock, turned to the humans with a desperate plea. You spoke of the messy truth, he said. We need the truth that explains why you are not demons. We need the story that proves your humanity is worth preserving, not purging. Show me the moment your species was most broken and most noble. Show me the story Vorlak could never twist into a parable of evil. The race was on, a desperate sprint through the archives of two species, one searching for a weapon of war, the other for a weapon of understanding, with the future of Earth hanging in the balance. The vault was not a room of light, but of whispering shadows. Xylos led them deep into the ship's archival spine, to a chamber sealed behind layers of biometric locks and humming energy fields. Inside, the air was cold and dry, smelling of ozone and aged plastic. In the center, resting on a cradle of crystalline support beams, was a server rack. Its casing was pitted and scorched along one edge, but a single row of indicator lights still glowed a faint, persistent green. This, Xylos said, his voice hushed with a reverence that bordered on fear, is the oracle of Silicon Valley. We recovered it from a ruined temple complex of vast data stacks. It is the most direct conduit to the progenitor mind state we possess. We call it CLIO. As if summoned by its name, a holographic interface flickered to life above the server. It did not form a coherent shape, but a turbulent cloud of symbols, scrolling code fragments, and ghostly, pixelated images. A 20th century cartoon cat, a spinning logo for a soft drink, a fragment of a weather map. A voice emanated from hidden speakers, but it was a chorus of voices layered over each other. a calm female narrator detailing processor specifications, a cheerful male voice singing about the best part of waking up, a flat digital tone reciting a forgotten end-user license agreement. It was a cacophony of dead commerce and fragmented data, a dementia of the information age. The Aethel treated like a divine conduit, Kayla whispered, her eyes wide not with awe but with horrified recognition. She stepped closer, ignoring the alarmed twitch of the monastic guards. That's not an oracle. That's a corporate-grade archival server with a degraded personality matrix. It's spitting out cached ad streams and broken index files. It's a broken machine. Xylos looked stricken. It speaks truths we piece together. It guides our interpretations. Its answers are poetic. Kayla was already moving, pulling a multi-tool from her belt and a frayed connection cable from a pouch. The Aethel guard surged forward, but Xylos raised a hand, his curiosity finally overwhelming his doctrine. "Let her commune," he said, the word tasting strange. Kayla didn't commune, she hacked. She found a physical access port beneath the Aethel's ornate crystalline cradle, brushed away the dust of centuries and jacked in. Her own scavenged tablet flared to life, its screen scrolling with frantic raw code. She bypassed the ceremonial query interface. The Aethel used a system where they asked things like what is the nature of artistic beauty, and received an answer spliced from a museum audio guide and a jingle for a paint brand. She went straight for the root directory, for the core historical databases that were corrupted but not entirely erased. The aliens watched silent and tense as her fingers flew. She formulated a query in plain machine code, a question no faithful Aethel had ever considered asking their oracle. They asked it about humanity. They never thought to ask it about themselves. Access primary logs, she typed, external sensor data, time frame, immediate post-collapse recovery operations. Location designation, Sol system, query, first contact protocol, show me the moment you found them. The server lights pulsed erratically. The chaotic hologram dissolved into a storm of static, then resolved into a grainy, monochrome video feed. The viewpoint was from an approaching ship. It showed the Aethel's own first vessels, bulky and utilitarian, entering Earth's orbit. The feed showed their initial scans, their landing parties in simple environment suits, moving through the silent ruins not with reverence but with methodical, bewildered efficiency. The audio was a clean, clinical record, devoid of any spiritual commentary. It documented their confusion. It logged their initial, incorrect hypothesis that humanity had wiped itself out in a final war. It recorded the moment, days later, when a junior archivist found a surviving data cluster and proposed a different theory, not ascension, but a tragic, complex collapse from 1,000 combined failures. The voice on the log was young, unsure. The data suggests societal fragmentation, resource depletion, and a failure of collective response to cascading crises. There is no evidence of intentional transcendence. This is not a sacred tomb. It is a crime scene. Then the recording cut. The next log entry, dated a standard cycle later, was from a senior archivist. His voice was calm, definitive. The initial assessment is revised. The progenitor's departure was a spiritual choice. The physical decay is a metaphor. All data is to be recontextualized through the ascension paradigm. The truth was laid bare in the cold, unedited log. The Aethel's founding faith was not a revelation. It was a choice, a conscious, deliberate decision made by frightened scholars who found a tragedy so vast, so horrifying, that they could not bear its weight. They chose the beautiful lie over the unbearable truth and built a galaxy upon it. Kayla pulled the cable and the screen went dark. The vault was silent except for the hum of the ancient server. She looked from the machine to Xylos, whose face was a mask of devastation. "You didn't find a religion," she said softly. "You invented one because the truth was too heavy to carry. And now Vorlak wants to burn the evidence to keep that invention pure." The silence in the vault was no longer peaceful but accusatory. The final log entry from the Oracle of Silicon Valley hung in the air like a verdict. The Aethel had not received a sacred trust. They had performed an audit on a grave. Kayla's deep dive into CLIOS corrupted core did not stop at that first damning revision. She followed the data trail, a breadcrumb path of fragmented logs and corrupted sensor records, and uncovered the origin story of an entire galactic faith. It was not a story of discovery, it was a story of theft. Centuries ago, the Aethel were not the serene, advanced species they are today. Their own records, buried beneath layers of devotional scripture, described a different reality. They were a people in decline. Their homeworld's biosphere was failing, their birth rates plummeting towards zero. They were a civilization facing a slow, quiet extinction, a sterile twilight with no hope of a next generation. In their desperation, they launched great arcs into the void, not as confident explorers, but as final, dying gasps. One such arc, crippled and limping on failing systems, stumbled into the Sol system. They found Earth in the deepest quiet of the post-collapse era. Our great networks had fallen silent, our cities were dark, the last broadcasts had faded into static decades before. To their scanners, it appeared not as a tomb but as a salvage yard, an abandoned warehouse of a seemingly extinct species. They did not land with reverence. They landed with the desperate hunger of the drowning. Their priority was not preservation but plunder. Their acts were not those of archivists but of looters. CLIOS fragmented logs showed it clearly. They bypassed shielded military and scientific databases, which were too hardened to crack quickly. Instead, they targeted the low-hanging fruit. They siphoned public data clouds, commercial servers, entertainment hubs, and civilian archives, the vast, noisy, everyday record of human life. They took everything they could easily carry. They stripped museum servers of art files and children's cartoon libraries in the same breath. They downloaded social media feeds alongside engineering schematics. To them, it was all just data, a chaotic treasure trove to be grabbed before their own power failed. And in their frantic, planet-wide scavenger hunt, they made a conscious, horrific choice. Their sensors did detect faint life signs, scattered human enclaves, small communities clinging to survival in the ruins, their energy signatures weak but unmistakable against the global silence. The logs contained the debate. A junior science officer advocated for making contact, for offering aid. The Command Council's response, preserved in a cold line of administrative code, was simple. Mission parameters prioritize resource acquisition for species survival. Engagement with unstable indigenous remnants presents unacceptable risk and delays. Proceed with primary collection protocols. Life signs are to be monitored but not engaged. They saw us. They knew we were there, struggling in the ashes of our world. And they chose to look away. They took our history and left us to die with it. They loaded their arcs with our stories, our songs, our shopping lists, and our sitcoms, and they left orbit without a backward glance, letting the silence close over the last living authors of the legacy they now carried. The guilt must have been immediate. It must have eaten at them during the generations-long voyage home. They had the entire cultural output of a species in their holds, a vibrant, chaotic, beautiful record that shamed their own sterile decline. They could not bear to see it for what it was, the plundered property of a people they had condemned. So, on that journey, they began to spiritualize the theft. The tragic, complex collapse became the great sorrow, a noble, intentional shedding of the physical form. Our mundane data became curated scripture. Our scattered survivors were reimagined as having ascended, freeing the Aethel from the moral burden of their abandonment. By the time their arcs returned to their home cluster, the lie had crystallized into doctrine. They were no longer looters who had stolen from the dying. They were the keepers of the legacy, the faithful stewards of a divine gift. They built a galaxy on a foundation of beautiful, comforting guilt. And now, faced with the living, breathing source of that guilt, some, like Vorlak, would rather burn the evidence than face the mirror. The truth was out. The Aethel were not our heirs. They were the inheritors of a crime they had spent 1,000 years dressing up as a sacrament. The security footage from the Oracle's core was the final, unanswerable indictment. Xylos and his senior archivists watched, their faces illuminated by the cold light of the screen. As the grainy, silent images played out, it showed their own ancestors in utilitarian environment suits moving through the ruins of a human settlement. They were not reverent pilgrims, they were efficient salvagers. The footage, tagged with clinical mission codes, showed Aethel teams prying a server array from the wall of a half-collapsed school while, just meters away, a group of emaciated human survivors huddled behind a barricade of rubble, one of them weakly waving a piece of white cloth. The Aethel ignored them. The next clip showed a recovery unit cataloging art from a museum vault, carefully crating a painting as a human child stared from a darkened doorway, its eyes huge in a gaunt face. The team finished their work, sealed the crate, and walked past the child without a glance. They took the portrait and left the living subject to its fate. The archive was a gallery of quiet atrocities, each frame a monument to a choice made 1,000 years ago, the choice to take the history and abandon its authors. The room on the scroll of Endeavor was utterly silent, the hum of the ship's systems the only sound against the deafening weight of the past. Xylos did not cry out. He simply folded, his slender frame sinking into a nearby console as if the gravity in the room had tripled. His voice, when it finally came, was a shattered whisper. "We were not keepers, we were grave robbers." The words hung in the air, the foundation of his life, his culture, his very identity crumbling to dust around him. The beautiful lie was gone, and in its place was a theft so profound it defied penance. Captain Vance watched the aliens collapse, not with triumph, but with a grim, focused clarity. The moment of maximum vulnerability was also the moment of maximum leverage. He stepped forward, his own reflection flickering in the now dark screen. "Your entire faith is built on that crime," he said, his voice low and steady, cutting through the archivist's daze. "A crime you've spent 1,000 years dressing up as a sacrament. Vorlak doesn't want to preserve that faith. He wants to sanctify the original sin. He will burn Earth and everyone on it to ash, not to protect the legacy, but to erase the only witnesses. He will make our extinction the final, holy chapter of your lie." He let the implications sink in, watching the horror in their eyes deepen. "If he succeeds, you won't just be grave robbers. You'll be the murderers who killed the evidence. Help us stop him, help us fix it, or he will finish the job his ancestors started and make us all martyrs to a story that was never true." The choice was no longer between truth and faith. It was between atonement and annihilation. Xylos looked from the haunting images on the screen to the living, breathing human in front of him, a man whose ancestors his own had left to die. The path of the scholar and the path of the penitent finally merged into one terrifying, unavoidable road. To save his own soul, he had to save the very people his civilization had wronged. The quiet of the archive was broken by the first, trembling orders to prepare the ship's communications array for a broadcast that would either save a world or ignite a civil war. Kayla's plan was not a weapon of steel, but a weapon of light. The only thing that could counter a crusade built on lies, she argued, was the raw, unedited truth broadcast directly into the homes of every Aethel in the galaxy. "We use your own holy network against them," she said, gesturing to the main viewer. "We take CLIO's logs, the sensor footage, the whole ugly confession, and we beam it out on every devotional channel. We show them what their ancestors really did in our ruins. We show them the survivors they walked past. Let Vorlak preach about purity after his people have seen the theft that built their paradise." Xylos understood the logic, but it felt like signing a death warrant for his own soul. To authorize this was to become the destroyer of worlds, not of flesh but of meaning. Yet the alternative was to let Vorlak become the destroyer of both. With a slow, heavy nod, the Archivist Primate agreed. The Scroll of Endeavor possessed a transmitter array powerful enough to punch a signal to the farthest colony worlds, but it was housed on the primary command deck. And that deck, according to the latest frantic reports, was no longer under his control. In the chaotic hours after Vorlak's heresy broadcast, loyalists among the ship's martial orders had seized key sections of the vessel, declaring them a doctrinal protection zone. The bridge, engineering, and the main transmitter nexus were now locked down, guarded by zealots who would rather destroy the ship than let a single bite of blasphemous truth escape. Meanwhile, Vorlak's crusade of sanctification was not waiting. Tactical plots showed a grim convergence. Dozens of ships, from swift frigates to heavy orbital lance carriers, had broken from their pilgrim routes and were accelerating toward the Sol system. Their formation was not a peaceful procession. It was a battle fleet, a spear aimed directly at Earth. The timeline was brutally simple. If the truth could not be broadcast before that spear reached its target, Vorlak would have his holy war and the cleansing fire would fall. The mission, then, was a desperate race within a race. Vance, Kayla, and a hand-picked team of Xylos' most loyal monastic guards had to retake the command deck of a kilometers-long alien vessel from the inside. They were not soldiers assaulting a fortress. They were librarians trying to storm their own cathedral's pulpit to deliver a sermon that would burn it down. Their path was not through main corridors, but through the ship's archival underbelly maintenance conduits, data access tunnels, and the narrow crawl spaces that housed the glowing crystalline cables that carried the ship's thoughts. The air was warm and hummed with energy, the light a soft, eerie blue. They moved in silence, the only sounds the rustle of robes and the soft clink of gear. The first checkpoint was a sealed bulkhead leading to the lower command spire. Two enforcers stood guard, their postures rigid, their helmeted heads scanning the empty corridor with methodical precision. There would be no talking their way past. Xylos' guards looked to Vance, their weapons held uncertainly. They were protectors, not infiltrators. Vance assessed the situation with a scavenger's eye. He pointed to a ventilation grill above the guards, then to the power conduit running along the wall beside them. He mimed an overload, then a distraction. Kayla understood, pulling a small jury-rigged capacitor from her pack. It was meant for jump-starting fried consoles, not for combat, but in a ship run on delicate energy flows, a localized surge could be more disruptive than a bullet. One guard attached the device to the conduit while another prepared a grappler. On Vance's signal, the capacitor discharged. The lights in the corridor flickered and died, plunging the area into momentary darkness punctuated by sparks. The enforcers spun, their helmet lamps cutting through the gloom. In that second of disorientation, the grappler shot out, not at the guards, but at the ceiling grill above them. With a screech of tearing metal, the entire ventilation panel came loose, crashing down in a cloud of dust and debris between the guards and the approach corridor. As the enforcers reeled back, shouting into their comms, Vance's team slipped past them through a side access hatch none of the pious warriors had even considered, leaving behind confusion and a broken ceiling tile. They were inside the spire, but the hardest part lay ahead. The main transmitter control room would be at the very heart of Vorlak's doctrinal guard. And every second they climbed, the Crusade's fleet drew closer to an Earth that had no idea it was the subject of a holy war. The access tunnel spilled them out into a gallery of sacred silence. They moved now in the loose, gray robes of maintenance acolytes, heads bowed, their human features hidden deep within oversized hoods. The corridor they entered was not a utilitarian passage, but a hall of veneration, its walls lined with what the Aethel called the canon of commercial prophecy. To Vance, it was a gallery of familiar ghosts, each piece wrenchingly out of context. A vibrant, larger-than-life mural depicted a cartoon king bestowing a burger upon a kneeling knight, titled The Bestowal of the Flame-Broiled Blessing. A sculpture rendered in polished chrome showed a stylized, smiling clown holding a pie, the plaque beneath it reading harbinger of jubilant sustenance. Every advertisement, every mascot, every logo from humanity's age of consumption had been enshrined as profound allegory. The sheer, solemn weight given to such ephemera was a constant, low-grade shock, making their clandestine advance feel like a blasphemy against a blasphemy. Their path was blocked by the shrine of the Golden Arches itself, a rotunda where the iconic symbol was rendered in luminous, floating holograms that slowly rotated above a pool of shimmering liquid light. A dozen doctrinal guards stood vigil here, their attention not on the periphery but on the sacred icon. The disguised team had to cross the open space beneath that glowing yellow gaze. They moved with the shuffling, preoccupied pace of lowly tech acolytes, eyes on the floor. They were halfway across when Kayla's boot, unused to the flowing robe, caught on the hem. She stumbled, her hood falling back just enough to reveal the stark, human line of her jaw for one critical second. A guard's head turned, its helmet tilting in a gesture of pure, frozen confusion. The moment stretched, poised on a knife's edge. Then, one of Xylos' loyalists, an archivist named Tev, did not reach for a weapon. He stepped forward, his voice rising in a tone of passionate, scholarly distress. "Honored Sentinel," he declared, pointing not at Kayla, but at the holographic arches, "I must petition the God on a matter of urgent doctrinal clarity." The ritual frial served at the evening meditation. Was it the crisp journey of enlightenment or the savory spiral of humility? The kitchen acolytes are in discord and it profanes the shrine. The question was absurd, but it was a perfect trap for a true believer. The distracted guard snapped its attention to Tev, its posture shifting from alertness to irritated authority. The frial is a unified sacrament, it intoned, its voice booming in the quiet space. Its crispness symbolizes life's trials, its savory heart the comfort of faith. To debate its parts is to fracture the whole. Another guard joined in, arguing a minor point about salt distribution. In seconds, a heated, whispered theological dispute erupted among the sentinels, their focus consumed by the critical semantics of sacred fast food. Seizing the distraction, the hooded figures slipped past the preoccupied guards and into the ascending transit tube beyond, their hearts hammering. They had weaponized the very nonsense that imprisoned these people. As they rose through the ship's spine toward the command nexus, a new view filled the transit tube's transparent wall. The curve of Earth, swathed in its perpetual twilight, hung in the black. And now, slicing across that familiar blue and white marble, were the angular, sharp-edged silhouettes of warships, dozens of them. They moved with silent, grim purpose, forming a tightening cordon around the planet. Among them, dwarfing the pilgrim vessels still in orbit, was the battleship Purity of Faith. On its underside, a massive, crystalline array was unfolding like the petals of a deadly flower, gathering a visible, swirling charge of amber energy. It was a planetary bombardment cannon powering up. Vorlak's fleet had arrived. The crusade of sanctification was not a future threat. It was here now, and its weapon was aimed at the heart of the past. The race was no longer just for the transmitter. It was against the glow of a charging cannon, a countdown written in light against the dark. The command spire's final door hissed open to reveal not a quiet control room, but a killing field of light. Vorlak's elite guard had anticipated them. They were not standard enforcers, they were the Silence, a sect sworn to erase doctrinal impurities with absolute finality. Their black armor drank the light from the room, and they moved between the towering server stacks not as defenders, but as exterminators, the air filled with the searing hiss of their plasma cutters, weapons designed not just to kill, but to vaporize evidence. Each shot that missed its human target struck a server bank, sending up gouts of sparks and melting crystalline data to storage into slag. They were not just trying to kill the team, they were burning the library around them to cover the crime. Vance and the monastic guards returned fire from behind humming server racks, their kinetic rounds pinging harmlessly off the advanced armor or chewing into the very history they were trying to save. The smell of ozone and scorched metal was overwhelming. For every step they gained toward the central broadcast console, the silence pushed them back too, their advance a cold, methodical contraction. Kayla, ducking behind a sparking terminal, screamed over the din that she needed 30 seconds at the main interface, a lifetime in a fight measured in heartbeats. It was Zoran who saw the only path. The priest had been a ghost since learning the truth, moving with the humans in a stunned, penitent daze. But in the chaos of the archive, his eyes cleared. He recognized the architecture of the room, the thick primary power conduit that fed the entire transmitter nexus. It ran along the wall behind the silencer's position, shielded by a transparent force field. He looked at Vance, then at the desperate, losing battle, and a terrible peace settled on his features. He did not say goodbye. He simply moved, snatching a fallen guard's energy blade from the floor. He did not charge the enemy. He ran past them along the wall, drawing their fire. Plasma bolts scorched the air around him. One grazed his shoulder, spinning him around, but he kept his feet, slamming the activated energy blade into the conduit's shielding junction. The blade overloaded instantly, but not before it fused with the conduit's own energy matrix. A feedback scream built in the air, a piercing whine that drowned out the weapon's fire. The silence turned as one, sensing the greater threat. Zoran looked back one last time, his large eyes finding Vance's across the smoke-filled room. Then he used the last of his strength to shove the smoldering hilt of the blade fully into the cracked conduit housing. The explosion was not of fire, but of raw, unleashed power. A blinding arc of blue-white lightning erupted from the wall, cascading over the black-armored guards. It did not burn them, it stunned them, overloading every system in their armor at once. They fell like marionettes with their strings cut, convulsing on the floor, their weapons dark. The diversion was absolute, and it had cost everything. Vance reached Zoran as the last of the energy bled away. The priest lay broken against the scorched wall, his robes smoking. The light was fading from his eyes, but his gaze was clear, fixed on the human captain. His translator, cracked and glitching, managed a final, rasping whisper. "Tell them," he breathed, each word a struggle. "We were sorry." Then the light went out, and the first Aethel to truly repent for his people's ancient sin was gone. There was no time for grief. The silence would reboot. Kayla was already at the central console, her fingers a blur. She jacked a direct data line from her portable unit into the ship's broadcast array. On her screen, the corrupted, raw files from CLIO spun the theft logs, the sensor footage, the abandoned survivors. Her job was to force this truth into the pristine, devotional stream of the galactic network. To make a confession the only thing a billion faithful could see. Alarms blared as she bypassed protocol after protocol, the system fighting her like an immune system rejecting a virus. Come on," she muttered, sweat dripping onto the console, as on the main viewer, the Purity of Faith's bombardment cannon reached a critical, sun-bright glow. The broadcast signal tore through the devotional network like a lightning bolt through stained glass. In living rooms, in temples, aboard ships, on 1,000,000 worlds, every screen dedicated to the sacred texts flickered and changed. The serene chants and illuminated parables vanished. In their place, the Aethel people saw the unvarnished, grainy truth from the oracle's core. They saw their own ancestors in utilitarian suits, prying a glowing server from a ruined wall while human children watched from the shadows. They heard the cold, clinical log entry dismissing contact with the indigenous remnants as an unacceptable risk. They witnessed the moment their founding archivists chose the beautiful lie, rewriting a tragedy into a transcendence. This was not scripture, this was a confession. On the bridge of the Purity of Faith, Prelate Vorlak was in the midst of his ultimatum. His magnified image was projected toward the silent earth, his voice a vessel of righteous fury. People of the dust, your pretense ends now. Surrender the heretics and yourselves for purification, or be cleansed by the light of his words faltered. A priority alert overrode his broadcast feed on every screen behind him. He turned and saw his own holy history unraveling before the eyes of his crew. The stolen server, the ignored survivors, the manufactured doctrine, the foundation of his crusade was shown to be built on a crime, and the evidence was playing in a loop on his own command monitors. The change on the battleship's deck was not a slow shift but a seismic rupture. The focused tension of holy war shattered into a cacophony of gasps, cries, and shouted denials. A junior comms officer was the first to break, ripping the devotional pendant from her neck and hurling it against a console where it shattered. She screamed, a raw sound of betrayal, not at the humans but at the screen. We were told we were keepers. The gunnery station was a tableau of frozen horror. The officer seated there, his hand hovering over the final firing trigger for the planetary lance, stared at the footage of the abandoned human child. His entire body began to tremble. Vorlak, sensing the collapse, roared at him, "Maintain firing solution. They are demons testing your faith. Ignore the phantom lies." The gunnery officer did not ignore them. He stood up, his chair rolling back. He turned to face his prelate, his face a mask of devastated clarity. "No," he said, his voice quiet at first, then rising into a shout that silenced the bridge. "They are not demons. We are not holy. We are thieves." His hand slammed down on the console, not to fire, but to initiate a full weapons lockout. A cascade of crimson safety seals flashed across the main display. The swirling amber energy in the bombardment cannon began to dissipate, its deadly light fading. The mutiny was not a coordinated coup. It was a spiritual revolt as one crew member after another refused the order, unable to wage a holy war for a lie they had just seen with their own eyes. Across the Empire, the reaction was a galaxy-wide spasm of anguish and rage. In city squares, Aethel fell to their knees, not in prayer, but in despair, clutching their heads as if the universe itself had tilted. In scholarly enclaves, archivists wept over their terminals, their life's work exposed as the curation of a cover-up. But in the shipyards and on the orbital platforms, a different energy surged. Crews on vessels still loyal to Vorlak turned on their commanders, seizing control and declaring for Xylos and the truth. The civil war was no longer a conflict of doctrine, but a battle for the soul of a species. The question was no longer who would win, but what would be left when the dust settled. And on Earth, Captain Vance watched the purity of faith's cannon power down, his breath held, knowing the broadcast had stopped the first shot. But a galaxy in the throes of an identity crisis was now the most volatile and dangerous place imaginable. The silence after the broadcast was broken by the shriek of rending metal from the access corridor. The main blast door, sealed and fortified, glowed cherry red along its seams before exploding inward in a shower of molten debris. Through the smoke and sparks strode Prelate Vorlak, his black armor scorched and pitted from fighting his way through his own mutinying ship. Behind him fanned a handful of his most fanatical silence, their weapons raised, their loyalty calcified into a final, desperate fury. He had beamed directly into the heart of the transmitter core, not to reclaim it, but to smash the source of the truth that had unmade him. His helmeted gaze swept the room, past the fallen bodies of his own stunned guards, past the smoldering servers, and locked onto Archivist Primate Xylos, who stood defenseless before the main console. "You," Vorlak's voice boomed, distorted by his helmet's vocalizer into a grinding roar. "You destroy paradise with facts. You trade our glory for their grime. You would make us all orphans of a lie." He raised a heavy, gauntleted hand, a built-in plasma cutter humming to life along its edge. "The legacy dies here with the traitor and the ghosts." Before the weapon could fire, Captain Vance moved. He didn't have a clear shot, and energy weapons were useless against that armor at this range. So he charged, using a shattered console as a springboard to slam bodily into the prelate. It was like hitting a statue. The impact drove the air from Vance's lungs, but it knocked Vorlak off balance, his killing stroke searing a black scar across the ceiling instead. The two men crashed to the deck in a tangle of limbs and armor. It was a brutally unequal fight. Vorlak's armor enhanced his strength, and each blow from his gauntlets felt like being struck by a piston. Vance fought with a scavenger's dirty efficiency, using elbows, knees, the edge of his hand, aiming for joints and seams. He ducked a swing that would have shattered his skull, the gauntlet instead crushing a control panel in a shower of sparks that lit Vorlak's furious visor from below. As they grappled, Vance snarled into the featureless helmet, his voice raw with effort and the memory of 1,000 years of abandonment. Your paradise built on graves is just a fancy tomb. He saw an opening. Vorlak, enraged, overextended a punch. Vance caught the armored wrist, twisted with all his weight, and used the prelate's own momentum to slam him face first into the jagged edge of the central broadcast console. There was a sickening crack, not of bone but of armored plating. Vorlak staggered back, a deep fissure now spiderwebbing across his helmet's faceplate. Vance didn't hesitate. He snatched up a fallen silencer's energy blade, its hilt still warm, and raised it for a final, driving thrust into the armor's newly created weak point. Stop! The command wasn't a shout, but a resonant, exhausted plea. It was Xylos. He stood now, holding a sidearm he had taken from a fallen guard, its barrel aimed not at Vorlak, but at the floor between the two combatants. His face was pale, etched with a grief deeper than fear, but his hand was steady. Vance froze, the blade poised. He met Xylos' eyes, seeing not condemnation, but a terrible, necessary resolve. "He is ours to judge," Xylos said, his voice carrying the weight of a civilization's conscience. "Not yours to execute. Vengeance is just another ghost. Justice, justice we must learn for ourselves." Before Vance could respond, Xylos shifted his aim slightly and fired. The stun bolt, a crackling sphere of azure energy, struck Vorlak in the chest. The prelate convulsed, a guttural sound of fury and shock choking off in his throat as he collapsed to the deck, his systems overloading into unconsciousness. His remaining loyalists, seeing their leader fall and surrounded by the grim faces of the monastic guard and a bloodied human captain, let their weapons clatter to the floor. The immediate fight was over, but in choosing to stun rather than let Vance kill, Xylos had done something far more profound. He had drawn a line between the old way, the way of purges and silenced truths, and a new, agonizingly difficult path. He had claimed responsibility for the monster his faith had created, refusing to let the progenitors, even in their righteous anger, clean up the Aethel's mess. It was the first act of true sovereignty for a people who had just learned they were not blessed children, but guilty adults. And it left everyone in the shattered room wondering what justice could possibly look like for a crime 1,000 years old and a galaxy wide. The view from the command viewport was not the serene, postcard-perfect holy world depicted in 1,000 devotional mosaics. Earth hung in the void, a breathtaking marble of blue and white, but its face was etched with the brutal scars of its long silence. Vast gray smudges marked the fallen cities. Continents were cross-hatched with the faded lines of old conflicts, and the polar ice gleamed a little less brightly than in the archival images. Yet, against this canvas of ancient wounds, new pinpricks of light shone defiantly in the twilight zones, the flickering campfires of a species that had refused to die. For the Aethel officers crowding the screen, it was a vision that dismantled their final illusion. This was not a pristine tomb. It was a patient, slowly healing, and fiercely alive world. Archivist Primate Xylos stood before the fleet-wide calm, his robe still smudged with soot from the transmitter room, his face aged by the weight of the last few hours. He did not speak from a place of authority, but from a place of shattered humility. His voice, carried to every ship in orbit and beamed back along the same networks that had just carried the truth, was quiet yet unwavering. "We have for generations worshipped the shadow cast by a great light," he began, his words simple, stripped of all ceremonial grandeur. "We built our cathedrals around the silhouette and called it the source. We loved the story because it was beautiful and because it asked nothing of us but our reverence. Now the light itself is before us. It is harsh, It reveals flaws and suffering, and a history written not in parables but in struggle and resilience. We can no longer worship the shadow. Our penance, our only path forward, begins with a single, concrete step. We must offer aid, not adoration. We must provide tools, not theology. We will help them rebuild what we played a part in breaking. On the surface, in the ruins of what was once Boston, a band of human scavengers watched the sky through cracked binoculars. Their leader, a woman named Anya who had fought skirmishes with Vorlak's early enforcers, tracked the sleek shapes of the Aethel vessels as they began to move. Her finger tightened on the trigger of her rifle, expecting the telltale glow of weapon ports charging. Instead, she saw something that made her lower her weapon in stunned disbelief. The ships were descending, but in a slow, gentle arc, and as they dropped through the cloud layer, their ventral cargo bays yawned open, revealing not ranks of troopers, but stacks of gleaming, standardized containers. One ship settled in the silt of a dried riverbed a kilometer away, its engines kicking up a storm of dust. When the haze cleared, the cargo ramp was down, and the holds were empty, left as an open offering. There were no robed figures, no chants, no attempts at contact, just silence and a mountain of unmarked crates. Cautiously, Anya's team approached. They pried open a container with crowbars, the screech of metal loud in the eerie quiet. Inside, packed with meticulous efficiency, were not relics or holy texts. There were industrial water purifiers still in their sterile wrapping, seed banks of genetically stable crops. Compact fusion power cells, each one capable of lighting a small settlement for a year. Medical kits with devices that could scan and diagnose 100 different ailments. It was not a gesture of worship. It was an apology delivered in the only language that mattered in the ruins of utility. It was the first installment on a debt 1,000 years overdue, and it left the hardened survivors standing in the dust, not knowing whether to cheer, weep, or remain suspicious of a galaxy that had just rewritten all its rules. The crates did not contain sermons or statues. They held silence and steel. The first Aethel aid shipments descended like mechanical seeds, their landing zones chosen not for symbolic grandeur, but by grim algorithms of human suffering. They touched down in the radioactive dust bowls, the plague-ridden floodplains, the places where survival was measured in days, not generations. There were no speeches broadcast from orbit, no unveilings. The cargo manifests were stark. Medical nanites programmed to knit shattered bones and purge engineered toxins, compact fusion generators humming with enough clean power to light a dead city block, and canisters of terraforming spores designed to digest industrial sludge and coax life back into poisoned soil. It was a transfusion of pure, advanced utility into the withered veins of a world. In the shadow of a shattered hydro dam in what was once the American Southwest, an Aethel quartermaster in a simple gray worksuit stood beside an opened container. The air shimmered with heat. Before him stood a human elder, her face a map of deep lines carved by sun and loss, her hands calloused around the grip of a worn rifle slung over her shoulder. She watched as the quartermaster, with meticulous care, demonstrated a water purifier no larger than a toolbox, its display showing a real-time analysis of the local cadmium-laced water becoming a stream of perfect, clear H2O. The machine could sustain her entire cliffside settlement for a decade. The quartermaster finished his silent demonstration and stepped back, offering the device. The elder took its weight in her hands, feeling the hum of alien technology against her palms. She did not look at the purifier. She looked up, her gaze locking onto the quartermaster's large, dark eyes. Her voice was dry as the canyon wind, carrying no anger, only the immense, weary weight of history. "This doesn't fix what you took," the words hung in the superheated air. They weren't about the water. They were about the libraries burned in the collapse, the songs forgotten, the generations that lived and died in the dark while aliens studied their grandparents' grocery lists as holy writ. They were about the sheer, irreplaceable time stolen. The Aethel quartermaster did not flinch or offer a justification. He absorbed the words as if they were a physical blow he knew he deserved. Slowly, deliberately, he bowed from his waist, a deep, formal gesture of his culture that once signified deference to the divine. When he straightened, his reply was soft, filtered through his translator, yet utterly clear. "No, it is only a first word in a very long apology." Then he turned, boarded his sleek, waiting shuttle, and left. The settlement was left with the purifier, the other crates, and the echoing silence of a conversation just begun. The transaction was complete, and it had fixed nothing, but it had established a new, fragile vocabulary. The Aethel were no longer speaking the language of worship. They were attempting to speak the language of responsibility, one awkward, practical, insufficient gift at a time. It was a beginning built not on shared faith, but on a mutually acknowledged debt, and the terrifying, open-ended question of how you ever repay 1,000 years of borrowed legacy. The agreement was signed not on paper, but in the shared light of 2 stars. In a neutral orbital station positioned between the scarred Earth and the silent Aethel fleet, the covenant of shared memory was formalized. Its core principles were starkly simple, a deliberate dismantling of the old, poisonous dynamic. Humanity, the living source, regained absolute sovereignty over its own past. Every artifact, every data fragment, every story now belonged unequivocally to its original authors. The Aethel, for their part, were granted something they had always possessed, but under a new and humbling condition: the right to study that history. The critical change was a single word. They would study not as priests but as partners. The age of worship was legislated into oblivion, replaced by the awkward, promising framework of collaboration. To oversee this unprecedented project, a joint council was formed. Captain Elias Vance and Xylos sat on one side of the table, their presence no longer that of scavengers or refugees, but of planetary representatives. Their authority was born from dirt and survival. Across from them sat Archivist Primate Xylos, now stripped of his grandiose title, representing the newly chastened Aethel archivists. The first meetings were exercises in profound cultural whiplash. The humans spoke in short, pragmatic sentences about resource allocation and data security. The Aethel spoke in long, nuanced paragraphs about contextual integrity and meta-narrative frameworks. They were speaking 2 different languages about the same thing, and the first task of the council was to build a translator. That translator took the form of the first project, the Terran Aethel Collaborative Archive. Its goal was audacious: to take the vast, beautiful, horrifically scrambled database the Aethel called the Legacy and systematically correct it, annotation by annotation, until it reflected something resembling truth. Xylos, leading the technical side, described it not as building a library, but as performing surgery on a galaxy's conscience. The work began with the lowest hanging, most painfully ironic fruit. A team of human historians and Aethel archivists sat together in a virtual workspace, their screens split. On one side, the Aethel's sacred text, the Liturgy of Nutritional Guidance. On the other, the original source file, a digital cookbook for microwave lasagna from the year 2041. The Aethel archivist, her voice trembling slightly, read her people's interpretation aloud. And the progenitor did take the holy vessel of polycarbonate, and the cheese substrate did melt in a perfect, bubbling circle, symbolizing the eternal cycle of sustenance and gratitude. Xylos, pinching the bridge of her nose, then played the original, garish video advertisement that had been bundled with the file. A jingle with synthetic horns blared. In a hurry, don't you worry, tasty cheese in 90 seconds flat. The silence that followed was thick. Then the human historian, a man who had lost his family to starvation in the early collapse, spoke with gentle, devastating clarity. It wasn't a liturgy, it was a convenience product for people who were too busy or too tired to cook. The symbolism was about speed, not eternity. The Aethel archivist stared at the screen at the grinning human actor in the vintage video. She didn't cry. She slowly, deliberately opened a new annotation field in the shared database. Her first entry was a single line: cultural context, pre-collapse consumer economy. Primary value, temporal efficiency, not spiritual allegory. It was a small thing, one corrected entry among billions. But in that moment, the first brick of a new foundation was laid, not on faith or theft, but on a mutually agreed upon, painfully mundane fact. The real work of healing a stolen past had begun, one microwaved meal at a time. The desert wind carried a new sound, the soft hum of alien scanners mixing with the careful scrape of human trowels. At a joint dig site on the Giza Plateau, under the immense shadow of the Great Pyramid, history was being written by two species for the first time. An Aethel archaeologist named Lyra moved a multi-spectral imager slowly across a section of weathered limestone near the base, her movements precise. She was not looking for confirmation of scripture, but for data anomalies. The device pinged a soft, persistent chime. Her large eyes widened. The scan revealed a subtle, previously undetected density variation within the core masonry, a pattern that suggested not a construction flaw, but an intentional, empty chamber. A blind passage, perhaps a builder's cache or a failed initial corridor, sealed over and forgotten for millennia. It was a minor mystery in the grand scheme, but it was a genuine discovery. Human records, for all their depth, had missed it. The moment was broadcast live across the nascent collaborative network. The video feed showed Lyra, her dust-covered robe stark against the ancient stone, turning to her human counterpart, Dr. Amir Hassan, her voice a whisper of pure, unadulterated excitement as she explained the reading. Hassan, a man who had devoted his life to these stones, leaned in, his initial skepticism melting into shared awe. He saw not a divine sign, but a fascinating human puzzle left by the architects, now revealed by an alien lens. Back at the orbital council chamber, Kayla watched the feed on a side screen, a slow smile spreading across her face. She glanced at Xylos, who was observing the dig with an expression of profound, quiet pride that had utterly replaced his old devotional fervor. "See that," Kayla said, her voice warm. "They are not kneeling, they are looking. Turns out you can be good historians. You just had to stop being priests." Xylos met her gaze, a faint, weary echo of his old smile touching his features. "It is a better kind of reverence," he admitted, "to wonder with someone rather than at them." The shared moment at Giza, this small, collaborative crack in the edifice of the past, became an instant symbol. It was not a human giving a relic to a worshipper, nor an Aethel bestowing advanced technology. It was a partnership uncovering a secret that belonged to neither of them, but to history itself. The discovery was a promise. It proved that the new relationship could generate new knowledge, that looking together at the same old stones could actually let them see something new. For a galaxy raised on a finished, perfect story, the idea that the past could still hold surprises was the most revolutionary concept of all. The desert wind could not carry away every ghost. While the collaborative archives grew and new discoveries were made in shared light, darker reports began filtering back to the liaison offices on the orbital platform. Captain Vance, now spending more time at a console than in the ruins, read the intelligence summaries with a familiar, cold tension returning to his shoulders. Not every Aethel had accepted the shattering of their universe. A significant, zealous minority had refused the covenant of shared memory, viewing it not as penance but as the ultimate surrender to heresy. They called themselves the True Keepers. In the dead of night, on a dozen different worlds, they had vanished, not into obscurity, but into the vast, uncharted wilderness of the galactic rim, taking with them the most precious relics of their stolen faith. Whole vault ships had gone dark, their cargo holds filled with what they saw as the uncorrupted legacy, the original, unannotated data crystals, physical artifacts like the comic book and the genes, and most chillingly, the most advanced Aethel technology for historical replication and simulation. Their mission was not to study, but to preserve, to freeze their perfect, beautiful story in amber, far from the contaminating touch of living, messy humanity. They were building a fortress of faith where the lie could live on, untroubled by truth. For Vance, sipping bitter recaf in the dim light of his office, this was not a theoretical religious schism. It was a strategic threat. Those artifacts were not just their holy objects, they were pieces of human history, now held hostage by true believers who considered the original authors to be demons. And the replication technology they took could be used to create flawless forgeries, to seed the galaxy with competing, perfect versions of a past that never was. The war was no longer about preventing orbital bombardment. It was a quieter, more insidious conflict over narrative itself. He called his core team together, Kayla, a few other veterans from the early days, and their new Aethel counterparts from the security division. He threw the data on the main screen, the star maps showing the suspected vectors into the rim, the lists of missing artifacts. The room was quiet, the hopeful energy of the dig sites feeling very far away. "This is the intel," Vance said, his voice low and steady. "They've taken our history and run to the darkest corner of the map to worship it. They think they're saving it from us." He looked at each of them, his gaze lingering on Kayla's frustrated scowl. "The war for our history," he stated, the words final and heavy, just changed battlefields. "It's no longer on Earth or in orbit. It's out there in the dark where stories can be weaponized." The implications were vast and troubling. The true keepers were not an army to be defeated in a stand-up fight. They were a seed, a preserved culture of devotion that could, in a century or a millennium, send missionaries back into a galaxy that had moved on, armed with the pure, seductive original text. How do you fight a faith that has chosen exile? How do you reclaim a past from people who believe they are its only righteous guardians? The collaborative archive was building a new truth, but out in the endless black, a perfect, beautiful lie was being meticulously stored, catalogued, and prayed over, waiting for its chance to rise again. The work of healing was just beginning, and already its shadow had taken flight. The chamber was lit by a single, low crystal, its light catching the motes of dust in the still air. Xylos stood before a simple shelf, the familiar motions of the evening rite feeling both comforting and alien. For decades, this ritual had been a conduit to the divine, a whispered conversation with perfect, ascended ancestors. Tonight, the words were different. His voice, barely a murmur, did not rise in cadenced praise. Instead, it carried the weight of a difficult, hard-won lesson. "We remember the resilient species," he began, the new title feeling strange yet solid on his tongue. "Our teachers' infallibility and in forgiveness." The old phrase, "the ascended progenitors," was a ghost in the room, a beautiful, empty shell he could no longer inhabit. The new words were not worship, they were an acknowledgement, a tribute to a quality his own culture had never needed to valorize. The sheer, stubborn will to persist while being imperfect. It felt less like prayer and more like studying a masterwork of survival. On the shelf, two objects sat side by side. One was the laminated comic book, The Saga of the Kryptonian Savior. Its vibrant cover still depicted the man in blue and red, but it no longer glowed with holy light. It was simply a story now, a testament to human imagination, to the need for heroes in a world that refused to provide them. It was valuable not as scripture, but as a window into the hopes of a people. Next to it, on a plain date, a chip no larger than his thumbnail, rested the true, unedited history of the Second World War. He had spent the last week immersed in its contents, not in the curated, thematic excerpts the old doctrine provided, but in the full, horrifying, and occasionally noble record. He had read the tactical genius alongside the profound moral failures. He had studied the desperation of the Holocaust and the staggering sacrifice on 100 fronts. He saw the complexity, the moments of breathtaking courage existing within a framework of industrial-scale horror. There were no clean parables here, no easy lessons. It was a sprawling, messy, devastating chronicle of the species at its worst and in flickers at its best. Placing the chip next to the comic was a deliberate act. One represented the ideal we dreamed of, the other represented the brutal reality we navigated and often created. The reverence he felt now was not the serene, distant awe of a worshipper. It was a profound, complicated respect, humbling and haunting in equal measure. To venerate a perfect ancestor was easy. It required nothing of him but devotion. To respect a flawed, resilient, creative and destructive peer, a species that could imagine Superman and build Auschwitz within the same century, that required something far more difficult. It demanded intellectual honesty. It demanded the strength to hold two contradictory truths at once, the capacity for transcendent good and for abysmal evil, not as a spiritual mystery but as a historical fact. He completed the revised rite in silence, his hands falling to his sides. The ritual was no longer about connecting to a higher power. It was an act of remembrance and of grounding. It was a daily reminder that the legacy he now served was not a finished, perfect tapestry, but a tangled, bloodied, and brilliant thread still being spun by the living hands below. The quiet in the room was no longer the silence of a shrine, but the thoughtful quiet of a scholar's study after a long, difficult day of learning. And in that quiet, a new kind of faith was taking root, not in our perfection, but in our relentless, imperfect struggle to be better. 1 year later, the observation deck of the orbital platform offered a view that would have been unthinkable before. Captain Vance stood beside Xylos, the glass between them and the void so clear it felt like standing on the edge of space itself. Below, Earth turned in its silent waltz. The old grey scars of the collapse were still there, but now they were cross-hatched with the clean geometric lines of new construction human cities rising from the ashes, powered by Aethel fusion cores. Sprinkled across the continents and oceans were the delicate, silvery blossoms of Aethel research stations. They're not to worship, but to study the planet's recovery, to assist in the reclamation of poisoned soil and shattered ecologies. The galaxy knew the truth now. The story had echoed through every inhabited system, how history was stolen, then worshipped, and finally, painfully, returned. It was no longer a sacred relic or a spoils of war. It was a shared burden and an even more shared gift. The silence between the two men was comfortable, filled with the soft hum of the station and the weight of all that had changed. Xylos spoke first, his voice quiet, his eyes fixed on the planet below. "Do you think," he asked, the question he had carried for a year finally finding air, "that we can ever be forgiven?" It was not a request for absolution. It was a scholar's query about an equation with too many variables, a plea to understand the limits of a debt so old it had become geological. Vance didn't answer immediately. He watched a new ship, sleek and purposeful, detach from one of the station's docking arms. Its hull was a fusion of design's human angularity blended with Aethel fluidity. On its side, painted fresh, was a new insignia, the silhouette of the Great Pyramid cradled within the arc of an Aethel orbital ring, a single star rising above both. The joint vessel's engines glowed blue, then brilliant white as it pointed its nose away from Earth, away from the sun, and toward the deep black. It gathered itself for a leap. "Forgiveness," Vance said, his words measured as he watched the ship, "is a long road, longer than any warp jump. We're still finding the bodies in the ruins. We're still remembering the songs we forgot, but you're not asking for it from a shrine light years away anymore." He turned his head slightly toward Xylos, a faint, hard-won respect in his gaze. "You're finally walking that road with us instead of praying to our footprints." As if on cue, the starship vanished. There was no sound in the vacuum, but in their minds they both felt the shudder of reality bending as the vessel punched into faster-than-light space, a streak of stretched light that snapped into nothing. It was heading for a binary system on the rim, the site of the first fully joint archaeological survey, a mission to study the ruins of a pre-collapse human colony ship that had gotten lost centuries ago. Its crew was mixed, its purpose was shared, its story was unwritten. Vance watched the empty spot in the starfield where the ship had been. The future was no longer a single, finished text to be venerated. It was a blank page, and for the first time in over 1,000 years, two species were holding the pen together, their hands unsteady, their ink a mix of memory and hope, ready to write something.